The humid air clung to my skin like a wet blanket, and the dense jungle seemed to breathe around me. My name is James Michael Thompson, and in 1967, I was just another 19-year-old infantryman with the 25th Infantry Division, dropped into the heart of Vietnam's brutal landscape. The sounds of distant artillery and helicopter rotors had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Our platoon had been patrolling the dense vegetation near Siu Chi for days, moving carefully through terrain that could hide an enemy soldier mere feet away. Every step was calculated, every rustle in the surrounding foliage a potential threat. We were young, scared, and trying to survive in a war that seemed more complicated with each passing day. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. The air was thick with tension, and our sergeant, a tough-as-nails veteran named Jack Rodriguez, had been especially quiet. We knew something was brewing. Intelligence reports suggested a significant Viet Cong movement in our sector, and we were on high alert. My M16 felt heavy in my hands, its familiar weight a constant companion. Rodriguez had drilled into us the importance of staying alert, of watching each other's backs. In this jungle, he'd often say, "Your buddy is the difference between life and death." The terrain was unforgiving, a maze of green so dense that visibility was reduced to mere yards. Sweat ran down my back, mixing with the mud and grime that had become a permanent part of my uniform. We moved in a tight formation, each of us scanning different sectors, our senses razor-sharp. Little did I know that within the next few hours, everything would change. The moment that would define my time in Vietnam was about to unfold, a moment that would test every ounce of courage and training I possessed. As we pushed deeper into the jungle, the silence was suddenly broken by a sound that made my blood run cold, the distinct click of a weapon being prepared to fire. The jungle erupted in chaos. Gunfire ripped through the dense vegetation, splintering branches and sending leaves cascading like a green rain. I dropped instinctively, my body moving before my mind could fully process what was happening. Rodriguez was shouting commands, but his voice was barely audible over the thunderous exchange of gunfire. We were ambushed, caught in a perfect kill zone that the Viet Cong had meticulously prepared. They knew these forests like the backs of their hands, and we were strangers in their domain. Bullets whizzed past my head, creating a deadly symphony of whistling metal and explosive impacts. Private Tommy Garcia, who had been my closest friend since basic training, was hit almost immediately. I saw him go down, his body jerking unnaturally as multiple rounds tore through his chest. The sight was horrifying, but there was no time to mourn, no time to process the loss. Survival became my only focus. Rodriguez was directing our counterattack, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Thompson," he yelled, "we need suppressing fire on the left flank." I understood immediately. Our position was vulnerable, and we needed to create enough confusion to allow the rest of the platoon to reposition. I switched my M16 to full automatic and began laying down a wall of covering fire. The weapon kicked hard against my shoulder, but I held it steady. Spent cartridges scattered around me, creating a metallic carpet on the jungle floor. I could hear the return fire from the Viet Cong, their AK-47s distinctive and brutal. The terrain worked against us. Every tree, every thick patch of vegetation could conceal an enemy soldier. We were fighting an invisible enemy who knew exactly where we were. Our training had prepared us for conventional warfare, but this was something entirely different. This was guerrilla warfare at its most intense. I watched as Rodriguez moved between our positions, coordinating our defense. He was a true leader, fearless in the face of overwhelming odds. Despite the chaos, he maintained a calm that was both inspiring and terrifying. His movements were calculated, precise, a dance of survival in the middle of pure carnage. The humidity was suffocating. Sweat mixed with dirt and blood, creating a grotesque war paint on my face and arms. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. Each moment felt like an eternity. Each breath could be my last. The sounds of war surrounded me. Explosions, screams, the constant chatter of automatic weapons. Our radio operator, Jenkins, was trying to call in air support, but the dense canopy made it difficult. Helicopters would have trouble navigating through the thick jungle. We were essentially on our own, a small unit facing what seemed like an entire enemy regiment. I remembered my training, the countless hours of preparation that had brought me to this moment. Stay calm. Communicate. Support your team. These were the mantras that kept me focused, that prevented me from succumbing to the paralyzing fear that threatened to consume me. As the battle continued, I realized this was more than just a firefight. This was a test of human endurance, of will, of the thin line between survival and total annihilation. And we were right in the middle of it, fighting for our lives in a war that many back home didn't understand. Little did I know that the next few moments would define not just my survival, but would become a testament to human courage under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The battle intensified, transforming the lush jungle into a hellscape of destruction. Our platoon was outnumbered, but we refused to surrender. Rodriguez had always taught us that retreat was not an option when American lives were at stake. Each of us was determined to make it out alive, or at least ensure as many of our brothers in arms survived as possible. I spotted movement in the dense foliage about 50 yards to our left. A group of Viet Cong soldiers was attempting to flank our position. Their camouflage was impeccable, blending seamlessly with the green and brown landscape. If not for my heightened senses and training, I might have missed them entirely. "Rodriguez!" I shouted, pointing toward the enemy movement. He quickly understood and signaled to two other soldiers to prepare for a potential side attack. The communication was instantaneous, a testament to our training and the bond we developed during months of fighting together. The next few moments became a blur of intense action. I fired controlled bursts from my M16, watching as the vegetation around the enemy position shredded under my fire. They returned fire immediately, forcing me to duck behind a large fallen tree trunk. The wood splintered with each incoming round, tiny fragments of bark exploding around me. Jenkins, our radio operator, was still trying to establish contact with our command. "Broken arrow! Broken arrow!" he kept repeating, the emergency code that meant we were in serious trouble and needed immediate support. But the dense jungle interfered with our communications, making it difficult to get a clear signal. My mind drifted momentarily to home, to my parents in small-town Ohio, to my girlfriend Sarah who was waiting for me. Would they ever understand what we were experiencing here? The constant tension, the split-second decisions between life and death, the brotherhood that formed under the most extreme circumstances. A sudden explosion rocked our position. One of our M67 fragmentation grenades had found its mark, creating a momentary gap in the enemy's line. Rodriguez seized the opportunity, directing a coordinated assault that pushed back the Viet Cong's initial positioning. But we knew this was far from over. The heat was unbearable. My uniform was soaked with sweat, dirt, and small patches of blood from minor wounds. The jungle seemed to close in around us, making our battlefield feel even more confined and dangerous. Every sound, every slight movement could mean the difference between life and death. I remember the stories my grandfather told me about World War II, how he described the intensity of combat. But this was different. Vietnam was a war without clear front lines, where the enemy could be anywhere, could look like anyone. We were fighting not just soldiers, but an entire environment that seemed designed to work against us. Another wave of enemy fire erupted. I could hear the distinct sound of an RPG being prepared. "Incoming!" someone shouted, and we all dove for whatever cover we could find. The rocket-propelled grenade struck near our position, sending a massive shockwave and debris flying in all directions. The battle was far from over, and we all knew it. Each moment was a test of survival, of courage, of the human spirit's ability to endure under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Rodriguez looked at me, his eyes communicating more than words ever could. We were in this together, and we would survive. As the intense firefight continued, I began to realize that this moment would define me forever. Whatever happened in the next few hours would become a part of my soul, a memory that would never truly leave me. The jungle watched, silent and indifferent to the human drama unfolding within its dense embrace. The battle reached a crescendo of violence that seemed almost surreal. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, each second feeling like an eternity, yet passing in the blink of an eye. Our platoon was now fully engaged in a fight for survival that would later be spoken about in hushed tones back at base camp. Rodriguez suddenly signaled me to move to a more advanced position. We needed to create a break in the enemy's assault, and he believed I was the best shot to do it. The trust was implicit. In combat, your life depends entirely on the men around you. I understood the risk, but also the necessity. Crawling through the mud and vegetation, I moved with a precision born of weeks of constant combat. Every muscle was tense, every sense heightened. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I could hear the distant sounds of my fellow soldiers, their controlled breathing, the click of weapons being reloaded, the occasional whispered communication. My target was a small rise about 30 yards ahead, which offered a strategic vantage point. The Viet Cong had been using similar positions to rain down fire on our platoon. If I could reach that spot, I could potentially turn the tide of the battle. Rodriguez's plan was calculated and dangerous, classic guerrilla warfare tactics. As I moved, a sudden burst of gunfire erupted near my position. Rounds tore through the leaves above me, sending a cascade of green debris raining down. I pressed myself into the ground, feeling the mud and rotting vegetation against my face. For a moment, I was practically invisible, blending into the landscape that seemed both my ally and my enemy. The weight of my equipment felt immense. My M16, extra ammunition, grenades, water canteen, each item now felt like it was made of lead. Sweat ran down my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't dare move to wipe it away. One wrong movement could mean instant death. I thought about the training we'd received, the countless hours of preparation that had brought me to this moment. Sergeant Rodriguez had drilled into us the importance of patience, of calculated movement. In the jungle, he'd often say, the first person to lose their cool is the first person to die. Another explosion rocked the landscape. I could hear Jenkins still trying to call for air support, his voice a mix of desperation and professionalism. The radio crackled with static, making communication difficult. We were essentially on our own, a small unit fighting against what seemed like an entire enemy force. My mind drifted momentarily to the broader context of the war. We were young men, most of us barely out of our teens, fighting in a conflict that many back home didn't understand. The politics seemed distant and irrelevant here. Survival was all that mattered. The bonds we'd formed were deeper than any political ideology, deeper than anything most people could comprehend. Slowly, carefully, I continued my advance. Each movement was calculated, each breath controlled. The enemy could be anywhere, behind a tree, in a hidden tunnel, camouflaged so perfectly that they would be invisible until the moment of attack. The jungle was their home, and we were the intruders. Rodriguez's voice came through on our low-frequency communication device. "Almost in position, Thompson," he whispered. "Remember your training. Stay calm. Stay focused." His words were a lifeline, a connection to something solid in the midst of absolute chaos. As I neared the strategic position, I could feel the tension building. This moment would define not just the battle, but potentially our entire mission. The fate of my platoon, of my brothers in arms, rested on the next few moments of action. The jungle watched, silent and indifferent, as human drama unfolded within its dense, unforgiving embrace. I was about to make a move that would change everything. The next moments would become etched in my memory forever, a sequence of split-second decisions that would define not just my survival, but the survival of my entire platoon. As I reached the strategic position Rodriguez had identified, I realized the full complexity of our situation. The terrain opened up slightly, revealing a small clearing that the Viet Cong had been using as a staging ground. Hidden bunkers, carefully constructed tunnels, and strategic firing positions became visible. It was a meticulously planned defensive position that would have decimated any conventional attack. Our enemy was not just fighting. They were fighting with a level of tactical sophistication that challenged everything we understood about warfare. I signaled back to Rodriguez, using a series of hand signals we'd practiced countless times. 3 quick movements. Enemy position confirmed. Multiple targets, high-risk area. He understood immediately. We had one chance to change the dynamics of this battle, and that chance depended entirely on precision and timing. My fingers wrapped around the M16, checking the magazine one more time. 30 rounds. 30 chances to make a difference. The weapon felt like an extension of my body now, no longer just a tool, but a lifeline. I could feel my heart racing, but my hands remained steady. Training had become muscle memory. The first part of our plan involved creating a diversion. Jenkins would use our radio to simulate multiple communication points, making the enemy believe we had more personnel than we actually did. Meanwhile, I was to provide a concentrated burst of suppressing fire that would momentarily disrupt their defensive positions. A sudden movement caught my eye. 3 Viet Cong soldiers were repositioning near a well-camouflaged bunker. Their movements were precise, almost dance-like in their efficiency. These were not amateur fighters, but seasoned warriors who knew every inch of this terrain. I took a deep breath. Everything Rodriguez had taught me, everything I'd learned in training, came down to these next few moments. Aim controlled. Short bursts. Create confusion. Give my team an opening. The first burst of fire erupted from my position. The M16 kicked against my shoulder, but I held it steady. Rounds tore through the vegetation, creating a wall of lead that forced the enemy to take cover. I could hear their return fire, the distinctive sound of AK-47s cutting through the jungle's dense atmosphere. Another explosion rocked the landscape. One of our M67 fragmentation grenades had found its mark, creating a momentary gap in the enemy's defensive line. Rodriguez seized the opportunity, directing a coordinated movement that pushed forward our platoon's position. Time seemed to slow and accelerate simultaneously. Each second felt like an eternity, yet everything happened with lightning speed. The jungle around me transformed from a peaceful green landscape to a war zone of incredible intensity. Leaves shredded by gunfire, trees splintered by explosions, the ground churned up by constant movement. I thought about the broader context of our mission, of this war that seemed increasingly complex and morally ambiguous. We were young men, most barely out of our teens, fighting in a conflict that many back home couldn't comprehend. The political discussions seemed distant and irrelevant here. Survival was all that mattered. My communication device crackled. Rodriguez's voice came through, low and controlled. Excellent positioning, Thompson. Keep them pinned down. His trust in me was absolute, a bond forged through weeks of constant danger and shared experience. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was about to reach its most critical moment. Everything we had done up to this point was preparation for what was coming next. The enemy was regrouping, preparing for a counterattack that would test every ounce of our training and resolve. As I maintained my position, I knew that the next few moments would determine not just our survival, but potentially the outcome of this entire engagement. The jungle watched, silent and indifferent, as human drama unfolded within its unforgiving embrace. The counterattack came with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. The Viet Cong had regrouped, and their assault was coordinated with a precision that spoke to years of fighting in this unforgiving terrain. Waves of enemy soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels and camouflage positions, their movements synchronized like a deadly dance. Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold the line," he shouted, his command carrying over the thunderous sound of gunfire and explosions. We had trained for this, prepared for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare you for the raw intensity of actual combat. Each of us knew that our survival depended on working as a single, unified organism. I shifted my position slightly, aware that staying in one spot for too long was a death sentence. The jungle seemed to come alive with motion, muzzle flashes erupting from multiple directions, the ground churning with debris and spent ammunition. My M16 felt like an extension of my body. Each movement calculated, each burst of fire a carefully orchestrated response to the incoming assault. A nearby explosion sent a shockwave that momentarily disoriented me. Dirt and fragments of vegetation rained down, creating a surreal curtain of destruction. I could hear Jenkins still trying to maintain communication, his voice a mix of determination and barely contained panic. Broken Arrow, requesting immediate air support. The radio crackled with static, a constant reminder of how isolated we truly were. No immediate help was coming. We were on our own, a small unit fighting against what seemed like an overwhelming force. Each of us understood the stakes. This was more than just a battle. This was about survival, about protecting the men beside you. I caught a glimpse of movement to my left, a Viet Cong soldier attempting to flank our position. Without hesitation, I swung my weapon and fired a controlled burst. The rounds found their mark, and the soldier went down. There was no time for reflection, no time to process the human cost of these split-second decisions. Rodriguez was moving between positions, a human rallying point that kept our platoon from breaking. His leadership was more than just tactical. It was a lifeline of hope in the midst of absolute chaos. I had seen lesser men crumble under far less pressure, but Rodriguez remained a beacon of calm in the storm of battle. The heat was unbearable. My uniform was soaked with sweat, mud, and small patches of blood from minor wounds. The jungle seemed to close in around us, making our battlefield feel even more confined and dangerous. Every sound, every slight movement could mean the difference between life and death. Memories flashed through my mind: home, family, the life I had left behind. But those thoughts were quickly pushed aside. Here, in this moment, survival was all that mattered. The brotherhood we had formed was stronger than any personal connection, a bond forged in the crucible of combat. Another wave of enemy fire erupted. I could hear the distinctive sound of an RPG being prepared. "Incoming," someone shouted, and we all dove for whatever cover we could find. The rocket-propelled grenade struck near our position, sending a massive shockwave and debris flying in all directions. I remembered the stories my grandfather told me about World War II, how he described the intensity of combat. But this was different. Vietnam was a war without clear front lines, where the enemy could be anywhere, could look like anyone. We were fighting not just soldiers, but an entire environment that seemed designed to work against us. The battle continued to rage, each moment a test of human endurance. We were pushing back against an enemy that seemed to emerge from the very landscape itself. The jungle was their home, their ally, and we were nothing more than intruders fighting for survival. As the intense firefight continued, I began to realize that this moment would define me forever. Whatever happened in the next few hours would become a part of my soul, a memory that would never truly leave me. The jungle watched, silent and indifferent to the human drama unfolding within its dense embrace. Rodriguez caught my eye for a moment, a look that communicated more than words ever could. We were in this together, and we would survive, no matter the cost. The battle reached a critical turning point. Our platoon had been fighting for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality, it had been just a few intense hours. The landscape around us was barely recognizable: shredded vegetation, crater-like holes from explosions, and the remnants of a brutal, unforgiving combat zone. Rodriguez made a split-second decision that would ultimately define our survival. "Thompson," he shouted over the cacophony of gunfire, "we're going to execute a counterassault. We can't keep taking this punishment." His voice was calm, but carried an urgency that brooked no argument. The plan was audacious and dangerous. We would use the very terrain that had been working against us as our primary weapon. The dense jungle, which had provided cover for the Viet Cong, would now become our means of surprise. Jenkins would create a diversionary communication sequence, making our enemies believe we were calling for reinforcements from multiple directions. I understood my role immediately. I would be part of the spearhead, moving with 2 other soldiers to create a breakthrough in the enemy's defensive line. It was a high-risk maneuver that went against conventional military wisdom, but Rodriguez had always been known for unconventional tactics. As we prepared to move, I caught a glimpse of the men around me. Each face told a story of survival, of brotherhood forged in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Tommy Garcia, who had been killed earlier, seemed to watch us from some distant memory. We were fighting not just for ourselves, but for him, for every soldier who had fallen. The next few moments would be crucial. Our movement needed to be precise, coordinated, and absolutely fearless. I checked my M16 one last time, ensuring a full magazine and clear firing path. The weight of the weapon, the equipment seemed to fade away. All that mattered was the mission, the survival of my unit. Rodriguez gave the signal, 3 short, precise hand movements that we had practiced countless times. Move forward. Create confusion. Strike hard. Our training took over, transforming us from individual soldiers to a single coordinated fighting unit. The jungle seemed to hold its breath as we began our assault. Our movement was unlike anything the Viet Cong had expected. We weren't retreating, we weren't simply defending. We were attacking with a ferocity that caught them completely off guard. My first burst of fire cleared a path through the dense vegetation. The M16 kicked against my shoulder, but my grip was steady. Rounds tore through the enemy's forward positions, creating holes in their defensive line. I could hear the return fire, the distinctive sound of AK-47s mixing with our own weapons. An explosion rocked the landscape to our right, one of our grenades finding its mark. The ground shook, vegetation erupted into the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Rodriguez was moving between positions, a human rallying point that kept our momentum going. I thought about the broader context of our mission, of this war that seemed increasingly complex. We were young men, most barely out of our teens, fighting in a conflict that many back home couldn't comprehend. The political discussion seemed distant and irrelevant here. Survival was all that mattered. The counter-assault continued. We were pushing forward, creating chaos in the enemy's ranks. Each movement was calculated, each burst of fire designed to create maximum confusion. The Viet Cong had been masters of guerrilla warfare, but now we were fighting on their terms, using their own tactics against them. As we continued our advance, I realized that this moment would define not just the battle, but potentially our entire mission. The fate of our platoon, of my brothers in arms, rested on these next crucial moments of action. The jungle watched, silent and indifferent, as human drama unfolded within its dense, unforgiving embrace. We were writing our own story of survival, of courage, of the incredible human capacity to endure under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The final phase of the battle arrived with a sudden, almost surreal intensity. Our counter-assault had pushed the Viet Cong back, but the fight was far from over. Rodriguez had positioned us strategically, using every advantage of the terrain and our remaining resources. I could see the exhaustion on my fellow soldiers' faces, not just physical fatigue, but the deep, soul-crushing weariness that comes from sustained combat. Our uniforms were torn, covered in mud, blood, and sweat. We looked more like ghosts than soldiers, moving through the dense jungle with a determination that seemed to defy human limitations. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the previous hours of constant gunfire. Rodriguez signaled us to hold our position, his experienced eyes scanning the surrounding vegetation. Something wasn't right. The jungle seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Then it happened. A massive coordinated assault erupted from multiple directions. The Viet Cong had been regrouping, gathering their final strength for one last push. Bullets tore through the vegetation, creating a wall of lead that seemed impossible to survive. I remember thinking about home, about my parents in Ohio, about Sarah waiting for me. Those thoughts lasted only a fraction of a second before training and survival instinct took over. We had come too far to fail now. Rodriguez was everywhere at once, directing our defense, coordinating our response. His leadership was supernatural, a combination of tactical brilliance and pure, unadulterated courage. "Hold the line," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Jenkins, our radio operator, was still trying to maintain communication. "Broken arrow. Multiple enemy positions. Request immediate support." The radio crackled with static, a constant reminder of how isolated we truly were. No immediate help was coming. We were on our own. My M16 became an extension of my body. Each burst of fire was calculated, precise. I could see the enemy moving through the vegetation, could hear their movements, could almost feel their presence. The jungle had become a living battlefield, with every tree, every bush potentially hiding an enemy soldier. Hours of combat had transformed us. We were no longer just soldiers. We were survivors, brothers bound by an experience that few could ever understand. The political complexities of the war faded away. All that mattered was survival, was protecting the men beside you. As the battle reached its climax, something extraordinary happened. Our coordinated defense, our unwavering determination, began to break the Viet Cong's assault. They had expected us to break, to surrender, to give up. Instead, we fought with a ferocity that surprised even ourselves. Rodriguez caught my eye for a moment, a look that communicated more than words ever could. We were in this together, and we would survive, no matter the cost. The final push came with an intensity that seemed to stop time itself. Our platoon moved as a single organism, each soldier knowing exactly what needed to be done. The Viet Cong assault began to fracture, their coordinated attack breaking down under our relentless defense. As the last shots were fired and the jungle began to settle, we realized we had survived something extraordinary. Not just a battle, but a test of human endurance that would define us for the rest of our lives. Hours later, when support finally arrived, we were a changed group of men. Some would receive medals, some would be recognized for extraordinary bravery. But we knew the real medal was survival, was the brotherhood we had forged in those impossible moments. I would later learn that Rodriguez recommended me for the Bronze Star Medal for my actions during the battle. But in that moment, all that mattered was that we had survived, that we had protected each other, that we had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. The jungle watched, silent and indifferent, as we collected our wounded, secured our position, and began the long process of understanding what we had just experienced. We were survivors, brothers, soldiers, forever changed by a single day of combat in the unforgiving Vietnamese jungle.